the winter of 1978, a chilling silence descended upon Sydney's northern beaches, a silence that would echo for decades and leave a permanent mark on the Australian psyche. It began with a name, Trudie Adams. 18 years old, confident, independent, and full of promise, Trudie vanished into the night after a Saturday dance at the Newport Surf Club. What should have been an ordinary evening turned into a haunting mystery, one that would expose dark undercurrents flowing just beneath the idyllic surface of a beachside community. Born in 1960, Trudie Adams lived in the tranquil suburb of Bilgola Plateau, part of the picturesque stretch of coastline north of Sydney. It was a time of relative peace in Australia. No internet, no mobile phones, and a cultural innocence that encouraged young people to explore the world around them with little fear. Trudie fit right into that era. She was known as lively, popular, intelligent, and dependable. Her circle of friends was tight-knit, and she had a close relationship with her parents, especially her mother, who would later become a vocal advocate for justice. The evening of June 24, 1978 was unremarkable, at least at first. That Saturday night, Trudie attended a dance at the Newport Surf Club, an event popular among teens and young adults across the northern beaches. These dances were casual, social gatherings, a space to listen to music, flirt, dance, and catch up with friends. Trudie wore a white dress, her long blonde hair falling naturally around her shoulders. Witnesses at the club later said she was in good spirits, chatting with friends, occasionally stepping outside, and later returning to the dance floor. At around midnight, the event wound down. Trudie told her friends she was leaving to hitch a ride home, something not uncommon at the time. Hitchhiking, though now unthinkable for many, was then a widespread and normalized practice in the area, especially along Barrenjoey Road, the main artery through the northern beaches. The road, named after the nearby headland, was known for its winding path, lined with thick brush and dotted with only occasional streetlights. It could be serene during the day, but at night, it transformed into a shadowed corridor, eerie in its isolation. Trudie was last seen walking along Barrenjoey Road near the corner of Anzac Avenue, heading south. She never arrived home. When her mother awoke the next morning and saw her daughter's empty bed, a sense of unease took hold. By noon, that unease had grown into terror, and a call was placed to the police. The local authorities at first approached the case as a routine runaway situation. Trudie was 18, legally an adult. It wasn't unheard of for young people to disappear for a few days following a party or family disagreement. But Trudie had no history of erratic behavior. She was responsible, had strong ties to her family, and hadn't expressed any desire to flee or escape. Within 24 hours, as it became increasingly clear that something sinister may have occurred, the case took on new urgency. The New South Wales Police launched what was, at the time, the largest missing persons investigation in the state's history. Over 250 police officers were assigned to the case. Air and sea searches were conducted. Volunteers combed through bushland along the road. Posters with Trudie's face were plastered across shop windows and bus stops from Palm Beach to Manly. The media picked up the story quickly, and soon the nation knew her name. Despite the intensity of the search, no trace of Trudie was ever found. No clothes, no belongings, no witnesses who could definitively say they saw her enter a car. But in the void left by the absence of evidence, something darker began to take shape. Over the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged, one that shocked investigators and the public alike. Women began coming forward with accounts of abduction and assault that had occurred along the very same stretch of Barrenjoey Road, many of them from the previous 7 years. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a series, eerily similar in method and execution. Multiple women described being picked up by a man driving a light-colored panel van, often posing as someone helpful or harmless. Once inside, they were taken to secluded bushland areas where they were threatened, bound, and assaulted. Some managed to escape, others were released under mysterious conditions. But what unified their stories was the cold, calculated nature of the attacks, the consistent use of Barrenjoey Road, and the suggestion that the perpetrator may have been a serial offender operating for years in the shadows. As police re-examined their files, the possibility of a link between these assaults and Trudie's disappearance became the leading theory. Yet it was a theory without a suspect. One name began to stand out: Neville Brian Tween. Tween was a career criminal with a long history of sexual violence, robbery, and deceit. He had ties to the northern beaches and had served time in prison for rape and assault. Most disturbingly, he bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions provided by several of the women who had survived abduction attempts along Barrenjoey Road. Tween owned a light-colored panel van at the time of Trudie's disappearance. Despite this circumstantial connection, investigators lacked the evidence needed to bring charges. There was no physical proof linking Tween to Trudie. Her body had never been found. No witnesses had seen her get into a specific vehicle. And while the testimonies of other women painted a disturbing picture, none could definitively tie Tween to the night of June 24, 1978. In the years that followed, the case remained cold, but it never truly disappeared from public consciousness. Trudie's mother, determined to find answers, pushed for accountability and reform. Her calls were not in vain. The case led to renewed scrutiny of how missing persons cases, especially involving young women, were handled in Australia. It also prompted greater awareness of serial offenders operating under the radar, using familiar streets and trusted personas as weapons. In 2008, more than 30 years after Trudie vanished, the NS government offered a $250,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in her case. It was one of the largest rewards ever offered in a missing persons case in the state. The announcement reignited interest and led to new tips, but again, no resolution. Then in 2011, the Nessie state coroner reopened the case with a formal inquest. The inquest sought to determine not only what had happened to Trudie, but whether the response in the immediate aftermath had been adequate. Over multiple days of testimony, police officers, family members, and former suspects were questioned under oath. The inquest did not provide definitive answers, but the coroner concluded that Trudie was likely murdered shortly after her disappearance, the result of homicide or misadventure. Still, no one was charged. Neville Tween had died in 2013, taking whatever secrets he held to the grave. The cold truth lingered. Despite one of the most exhaustive investigations in Australian history, Trudie Adams had simply vanished, and whoever was responsible had never faced justice. But even death could not erase all clues. In 2018, the case made headlines once again. A tip, reportedly from a former police officer, suggested that Trudie's remains might be buried in bushland near Christmas Tree Hill, a remote area of Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park. The area was thoroughly searched by cadaver dogs and forensic teams. Soil samples were taken. Drones scanned the canopy for disturbances. Yet once again, the search yielded nothing definitive. No bones, no clothing, no signs of a grave. And so the mystery endured. But there is more, much more to uncover. This was not just the story of one girl. It was the story of a system that may have overlooked patterns, of predators who learned how to hide in plain sight, and of a community that still, decades later, asks, what really happened to Trudie Jeanette Adams on that cold June night? The silence that followed the disappearance of Trudie Jeanette Adams in 1978 was not just that of a family struck by grief. It was the uneasy hush of an entire region confronting the terrifying realization that a predator had been hiding in plain sight for years. What began as a search for a missing girl soon expanded into a complex web of previously unconnected crimes, flawed responses, and chilling patterns that only grew darker the closer you looked. In the weeks after Trudie's vanishing, the New South Wales police received an outpouring of information from members of the public. Some were tips, others were long-forgotten memories. But a startling number came from women who had suffered abductions and sexual assaults along the northern beaches, especially near or along Barrenjoey Road, and the stories they told shared far too many similarities to ignore. The accounts spanned from 1971 to 1978. Most victims had never come forward, believing their experience had been isolated or fearing they wouldn't be believed. Now, with Trudie's story dominating newspapers and television broadcasts, many felt compelled to speak up, not just for justice, but out of fear that the man who had attacked them might still be at large. Many described being picked up while hitchhiking, usually alone, and by a driver who seemed calm and friendly at first. But once inside the car, often described as a light-colored Holden panel van, the demeanor would shift. In some cases, the driver brandished a weapon. In others, he used physical force to restrain the victims. He drove them to remote areas, bushland, or construction sites, where he raped and threatened them, sometimes keeping them for hours. The physical and emotional details of the assaults were horrifying, but so was their consistency. Police soon realized they weren't dealing with a random predator. They were looking at a pattern that spanned the better part of a decade. A methodical, calculating offender who knew the terrain, chose isolated locations, and used fear as a tool of silence. One survivor described the man as charming at first, but cold in the eyes, like he was acting the whole time. Others mentioned how he seemed to know the back roads perfectly, never hesitating, never panicking. As the accounts mounted, police created a profile. A white male, most likely in his late 20s to early 30s in the mid-1970s. Strong, persuasive, organized, and unafraid of taking risks. He likely had a criminal record, perhaps a background in theft or violence. And crucially, he was familiar with the northern beaches, not just the roads, but the rhythms of the community. He knew when young women would be walking alone. He knew how long it would take police to respond, and he knew how to make people disappear. One of the first suspects to draw attention was Neville Bryan Tween. Born in 1939, Tween had a lengthy rap sheet that included fraud, theft, and sexual assault. He had lived in the northern beaches during the 1970s and had access to a panel van matching the description given by numerous survivors. But more disturbingly, Tween had been accused multiple times of sexually assaulting women in situations eerily similar to the Barrenjoey Road attacks. One of his known victims was taken to a secluded area and raped at knife point, just as several others had described. Tween had served time in prison in the early 1970s, but was released by the middle of the decade, during which several of the most violent and organized assaults were reported. Police interviewed him multiple times in connection with Trudie's disappearance and the string of attacks, but he denied all involvement. He never confessed, and authorities could never find definitive physical evidence linking him to any of the unsolved crimes. He died in 2013, leaving behind a trail of suspicion and a deep sense of unfinished justice. Yet he was not the only person of interest. Another man who came under scrutiny was Raymond John Ackhurst, a convicted sex offender who lived in the northern beaches during the time of the assaults. He was also known to own a panel van and was arrested in 1979 for multiple charges of rape and abduction. Ackhurst's victims gave accounts that matched the Barrenjoey Road profile, particularly his use of charm followed by violent coercion. He was eventually convicted and imprisoned, but again, no evidence definitively tied him to Trudie Adams. These recurring patterns raised difficult questions for the community. How could so many women have been attacked along the same road with so many similar details, and yet the perpetrator, or perpetrators, remained free for so long? Were the assaults investigated properly at the time? Did authorities connect the dots too late? Many of the victims believed the system had failed them. In 2018, when several survivors of the Barrenjoey Road attacks were interviewed by the ABC for the investigative series The Teacher's Pet, and later for Barrenjoey Road, they spoke candidly about their experiences. One woman described being dismissed by police after reporting an assault, told it was likely a misunderstanding. Another revealed that her report had been filed and forgotten, never followed up. These were not isolated administrative errors. They were part of a broader institutional failure, one that, in retrospect, may have allowed a serial predator to operate with impunity. The media attention that resurfaced in the 2000s, especially after the inquest in 2011, helped bring new urgency to the case. Trudie's story became more than just a local mystery. It became a symbol of lost innocence, of how darkness can hide in even the most beautiful places. Investigative journalists began revisiting the timeline. Old police records were re-examined. Former detectives were contacted, and with each new report, the portrait of the northern beaches in the 1970s grew more unsettling. One of the most damning realizations to emerge was that these crimes weren't being treated as connected for years. Assault cases were often siloed, handled by different officers, different departments. The pattern that now seems so clear, a series of abductions, rapes, and attacks involving women hitchhiking at night in the same area, had gone unrecognized in real time. And Trudie Adams may have paid the ultimate price for that delay. Another critical element of the story is Trudie herself. In the years since her disappearance, much has been written and speculated about her final night, who she spoke with, whether she had plans to meet someone, and what exactly happened between leaving the Newport Surf Club and vanishing into the dark. But every account confirms that Trudie was in good spirits, untroubled, and looking forward to going home. She had not run away. She had not gone off the grid. She was abducted. And the tragedy of her story lies in the reality that she trusted the world she knew, a community where she felt safe enough to hitchhike at midnight. In 2008, as the 30-year anniversary of Trudie's disappearance approached, Her mother once again pleaded for answers. The New South Wales government raised the reward to $250,000, hoping someone, somewhere, would step forward with the missing piece. Perhaps an old acquaintance of a suspect, perhaps someone who had overheard a confession, or perhaps someone who had always suspected but had stayed silent out of fear. Yet no one came forward with conclusive evidence. It was around this time that attention began shifting toward a specific location, Christmas Tree Hill, a heavily forested area in the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park. A tip had come from someone claiming insider knowledge, allegedly a former law enforcement officer, that Trudie's body had been buried there not long after her disappearance. The location matched several elements of earlier suspect behavior. It was remote, accessible only to those who knew the area well, and difficult to search thoroughly without modern forensic equipment. Police responded with a new operation. Forensic specialists, cadaver dogs, archaeologists, and mapping experts were brought in. The area was combed with ground-penetrating radar and infrared imaging. Small bones were discovered but later determined to be animal remains. Soil was tested for signs of decomposition. Yet again, despite the effort, no trace of Trudie was found. The disappointment was profound, but not surprising. Decades had passed. The forest had grown. Time, as it always does, had covered its tracks. By the late 2010s, Trudie's case had become a staple of Australian true crime, often cited as one of the country's most significant cold cases. But beyond the media coverage, the story remained deeply personal. Her friends had grown older. Some had children of their own, who reached the age Trudie was when she vanished. Her parents aged with the burden of not knowing, and her community, the sunlit coastal towns of Avalon, Newport, and Palm Beach, still carried the weight of that one night in 1978. Perhaps one of the most moving reflections of Trudie's enduring presence in public memory came from the reappearance of a film, Highway 1. Shot in 1977, just a year before her disappearance, the surf movie featured a brief appearance by Trudie herself. The footage showed her smiling, vibrant, living fully in the moment, unaware of what would soon follow. For many, it was the first time they had seen her move, heard her voice. It humanized her in a way that no missing poster ever could. And yet, for all the emotion, for all the public retrospectives, one question continued to hang over everything. Who was responsible? There is no definitive answer, and that is the tragedy. But there is more to explore. A deeper investigation into the lives and actions of those most suspected, the institutional responses that followed, and the societal shifts that Trudie's story helped to inspire. Because the story of Trudie Adams does not end with her disappearance. It continues. Through the interviews, the reopenings, the investigations, the echoes of women who came forward, and the still urgent hope that one day, someone will talk. And when they do, the darkness that began on Barrenjoey Road may finally begin to lift. There are some stories that refuse to fade, not because of sensational headlines or public obsession, but because of what they represent: an unhealed wound, a question left unanswered, a silence that echoes across generations. The disappearance of Trudie Jeanette Adams is one such story, and in the decades after her vanishing, as new generations of Australians came of age, the mystery of what happened on that cold June night in 1978 evolved into something more, a symbol of justice delayed, of women unheard, and of a country forced to confront its failures. For years, the case remained dormant. A few front-page revivals here, a TV segment there, each returning to the same basic facts, the same unending questions. But then in the 2010s, something changed. The emergence of new forms of storytelling, long-form podcasts, investigative documentaries, digital archives, brought the case back into public consciousness with a force more powerful than anyone could have predicted. It began fittingly with a voice. In 2018, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, launched a groundbreaking multi-platform investigation titled Barrenjoey Road. It combined a podcast, a television series, and an online investigative hub, all focused on unpacking what really happened to Trudie Adams. The timing was crucial. Australia, like much of the world, was in the midst of a cultural reckoning. The modern Me Too movement had opened the floodgates on previously silenced conversations about abuse, institutional accountability, and the persistent undervaluing of women's voices. Trudie's story, long viewed as a sad cold case, was now recast as part of a much broader narrative. What Barrenjoey Road revealed was not only disturbing, it was infuriating. The journalists behind the series, notably Ruby Jones and investigative producer Dan Box, uncovered evidence of systemic failure within the original police investigation. Survivors of assaults along the same stretch of road described how they had reported their attacks in the 1970s, only to be ignored, dismissed, or left to fend for themselves. Some were teenagers at the time, terrified and alone. Others were told directly by police not to make a fuss. Still others had their statements filed and forgotten. This wasn't mere oversight, it was negligence. And it wasn't just the survivors who spoke. Former detectives came forward too. Some admitted that they had suspected a serial predator was operating along Barrenjoey Road, but were restricted by a lack of interdepartmental coordination and outdated investigative protocols. Others confessed that they hadn't taken the initial complaints seriously, a reflection of a deeply ingrained cultural bias that viewed assaults on young women as unfortunate, but not urgent. Had the police acted more decisively on the earlier cases, could Trudie have been saved? The question remains, haunting and unanswerable. The documentary series also reintroduced audiences to two of the key persons of interest, Neville Bryan Tween and Raymond John Ackhurst. Both men had long criminal histories. Both had lived in or frequented the northern beaches during the 1970s, and both had been accused of sexual assaults bearing chilling similarities to Trudie's presumed abduction. While neither was ever charged in her case, the evidence surrounding them painted a portrait of a time and place where known offenders could operate with little scrutiny. Tween, in particular, emerged as a central figure. In addition to his criminal record, he had reportedly bragged to prison cellmates about his knowledge of what happened to Trudie. Statements that were inconsistent, chilling, and ultimately inadmissible in court. When he died in 2013, many feared that whatever truths he held had died with him, but his name, now public, became a lightning rod for anger, for speculation, and for renewed calls for accountability. Meanwhile, Ackhurst's known offenses and violent tendencies positioned him as a potential suspect. But again, no definitive link could be drawn. The gap between speculation and prosecution remained painfully wide. One of the most emotionally resonant moments in the investigation came when ABC reporters uncovered the original police notebooks from the 1978 investigation. Stored in the archives, brittle with age, the notebooks contained interview summaries, timelines, and handwritten observations. Some details had never been publicly released. Others contradicted earlier narratives, suggesting that early assumptions about Trudie's state of mind or potential plans that night may have been misrepresented. It was a powerful reminder of how time distorts memory and how critical it is to preserve the raw material of justice. As Barrenjoey Road unfolded, public response surged. People wrote in. Women shared their own experiences of assault and being dismissed. Some even came forward with new information about the night Trudie vanished. One anonymous source claimed to have been at a party near Newport that night and remembered a man matching Tween's description leaving in a hurry. Another recalled hearing years later a confession whispered at a surf club gathering. These tips were investigated. Some led nowhere. Others raised new questions. None cracked the case, but they kept it alive. The series also spurred renewed interest from law enforcement. In 2018, New South Wales police returned to Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, acting on previously disregarded information. A large-scale search was conducted at Christmas Tree Hill, a remote, overgrown section of the park that had long been rumored as a burial site. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Forensic teams combed the forest floor. Soil samples were tested. Aerial drones were used to scan for disruptions in the tree canopy, a sign of past digging or land disturbance. The operation lasted days. Once again, nothing was found. No bones, no clothes, no physical proof of where Trudie had gone. But the effort wasn't wasted. It showed that authorities were still willing to try, that the case had not been abandoned. But the most profound shift was not in the bushland. It was in public awareness. For the first time in decades, Trudie Adams wasn't just a name on a missing persons poster. She was real, tangible. A young woman with a voice, a face, a life interrupted. Archival footage from the 1977 surf movie Highway 1, where she appears briefly, was rediscovered and widely circulated. In the film, Trudie is seen laughing, playing, carefree, completely unaware of what fate awaited her. For many, it was the first time they had seen her in motion. For her mother and her friends, it was a reminder of everything lost. Trudie's case also became a flashpoint in broader discussions about how Australia handles gender-based violence and cold cases. Advocates called for reforms to how survivors are treated by police, including specialized training for investigators and greater legal protections for victims who come forward. Lawmakers debated funding increases for historical crime units, pointing to the Adams case as a symbol of why long-closed files should never be forgotten. And in classrooms, community centers, and even Parliament, her name was invoked not as a mystery, but as a mission. Still, the core truth remained. No one had been held accountable, no body had been found, no family had received closure, and perhaps most frustratingly, the investigation, despite its renewed momentum, still lacked a definitive forensic breakthrough. The era in which Trudie disappeared had left few technological traces. There were no surveillance cameras, no mobile phone data, no digital footprints. Everything depended on witness memories, scattered reports, and an incomplete paper trail. And yet there are some who believe that justice is still possible, that somewhere, perhaps buried in an old report or hidden in the guilt of a fading witness, lies the clue that could finally solve the case. Law enforcement continues to receive occasional tips. A dedicated cold case unit still reviews relevant information, and every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, the community of Newport gathers in silence, lighting candles not only for Trudie, but for every woman who was never believed, never heard, or never found. In the decades since her disappearance, Trudie Adams has become something larger than the tragedy itself. She has become a prism through which Australia sees its past and measures how far it still has to go. Her case is taught in universities. It's studied in journalism courses, criminology departments, and police academies. Her image, Forever 18, is etched into the collective memory of a country still searching for answers. But to understand the full impact of her story, one must also examine what came next. The policy changes, the public campaigns, the investigative shifts inspired by her case. These were not empty gestures. They were real responses, born of real loss, and they deserve to be told. Because the story of Trudie Jeanette Adams is not over. It is not locked in a single night or even a single crime. It stretches outward, through decades of silence, into the lives of survivors who finally spoke, into the voices of journalists who refused to forget, and into the hearts of Australians who still believe that one day, the truth will be known. It's been more than 4 decades since Trudie Jeanette Adams vanished into the cold night air of Sydney's northern beaches. More than 40 years of questions without answers, 40 years of searching without finding, and yet her story has never left us. It lives on, not only in the headlines or dusty case files, but in the policies that were changed, the people who spoke out, and the cultural reckoning that her name continues to provoke. The disappearance of Trudie Adams was not the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a national conversation about justice, memory, and the value of every voice that was once ignored. In the years following the original investigation, law enforcement in New South Wales and across Australia was forced to look inward. The Adams case became a symbol of the shortcomings in how missing persons cases, especially those involving young women, had been handled. The 1978 response, while massive in scale, had lacked coordination and long-term strategy. Leads were lost, patterns were missed, survivors of other crimes were overlooked, and perhaps most tragically, lives were endangered because a predator was allowed to operate unchecked for years. One of the most lasting legacies of the case was a transformation in how sexual assault reports were documented and pursued. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was not uncommon for victims of rape or attempted rape to be dismissed, disbelieved, or blamed. The language used in police reports, the lack of trauma-informed training, and the absence of specialized units contributed to a culture where survivors were often silenced twice, first by their attacker, and again by the system. As public scrutiny intensified in the wake of the Adams case, New South Wales police began to implement structural changes. Over time, this included the creation of dedicated sex crime squads, the development of victim liaison programs, and the gradual rollout of forensic and behavioral profiling units. These were not overnight fixes, nor were they perfect, but they marked the beginning of an institutional shift toward listening, believing, and acting with purpose. Trudie's case also helped change how missing persons files were treated. In earlier decades, many disappearances were automatically categorized as runaways, particularly when the individual was over 16. There was often a waiting period before investigations began, and precious hours were lost in those early critical moments. In the wake of her case, advocates, including Trudie's own family, pushed for reforms to ensure that every disappearance was taken seriously from the start. Today, rapid response protocols, media alerts, and centralized databases are standard practice, in part because of the failures exposed by her story. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Adams case lies in how it reshaped the national conversation around women's safety. Australia in the 1970s was a country in transition, caught between the freedom of post-war prosperity and the growing social awareness of the feminist movement. Hitchhiking was common, but so was the assumption that women should be careful, modest, not tempt fate. The idea that someone like Trudie, independent, confident, hitchhiking home from a dance, could become a victim was not, at first, seen as a systemic issue. It was a cautionary tale. But over time, that view changed. The women who came forward to tell their stories of being attacked on the same road in the same van by men who were never caught forced Australia to confront a darker truth, that this wasn't about bad luck. It was about a system that had failed to protect them. In classrooms, Trudie's case began to be taught as an example of both criminology and media responsibility. In community centers and advocacy groups, her name became a rallying cry for better protections and stronger investigative standards. And in the corridors of power, legislators cited her story when debating legal reforms related to sexual violence, cold case funding, and survivor support services. One of the most powerful expressions of this shift came in 2011, during the New South Wales State Coroner's inquest into Trudie's disappearance. Though the case was over 3 decades old, the inquest brought renewed media attention and public engagement. Testimonies were heard, the history of the original investigation was dissected, and the coroner delivered a solemn but clear conclusion that Trudie Jeanette Adams had likely been murdered in or around the time she vanished, and that foul play was strongly suspected. That single sentence, strongly suspected, may seem small, but for her family, her friends, and the advocates who had spent years fighting for recognition, it was a validation long overdue. It meant the system now acknowledged what they had known all along, that Trudie hadn't simply walked away, she had been taken. The inquest also spotlighted the role of media, both in 1978 and in the years since. Journalists had kept the case alive, from the early stories in the Sydney Morning Herald to the digital resurgence through ABC's Barrenjoey Road podcast and television series. The investigative journalism behind those series did more than inform. It uncovered new leads, revealed inconsistencies, and gave voice to survivors who had never been heard. One of those survivors, known publicly only as Mary, had reported her own abduction and assault in 1975, 3 years before Trudie disappeared. Her story bore all the hallmarks of what would later happen to Trudie. Hitchhiking at night, picked up by a man in a light-colored van, taken to remote bushland and assaulted. At the time, Mary had reported the incident to police. Her case was closed without further investigation. It was only decades later, in the wake of Trudie's disappearance in the ABC documentary, that her story was seen in its proper context, as a missed warning, a missed opportunity to stop a predator before he could strike again. The weight of these missed opportunities is something that continues to resonate, and yet in the midst of that weight, there is resilience. Trudie's family, especially her mother and stepfather, never gave up. Year after year, they spoke to media, attended community events, met with investigators, and pushed for answers. They did so not out of obligation, but out of love, and out of a deep, unwavering belief that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. Today, the case remains open. A $250,000 reward is still offered for information leading to a conviction. Cold case detectives continue to review evidence. Forensic technologies, unthinkable in 1978, are now being applied to old material in hopes of extracting new information. DNA analysis, geographic profiling, digital reconstruction, all tools that could, even after all this time, break the silence. But the truth is, we may never know exactly what happened on that night. We may never know who stopped their van along Barrenjoey Road, who opened the door, who drove into the dark with an 18-year-old girl in a white dress. We may never know where she was taken, or how her life ended, and that uncertainty is its own kind of grief. Yet what we do know, what time has made undeniably clear, is that Trudie's story changed lives. It exposed cracks in the system. It gave courage to survivors. It forced conversations that had long been avoided, and it reminded us all that justice is not only about convictions. Sometimes justice is about memory, about refusing to forget. Today in Newport, there are no monuments to Trudie Adams, no statues, no plaques on barren Joey Road, but there are stories. There are families who talk about her over dinner, young women who learn her name in school, detectives who walk into the cold case unit each morning and see her face on the board. There are journalists who ask questions, and there are people, thousands of them, who still care. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of all, because some stories never fade. Some voices, silenced too soon, continue to echo, and some names remain etched not in stone, but in conscience. Trudie Jeanette Adams was more than a mystery. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and laughter and a life that mattered. She did not choose to become a symbol, but in losing her, we were forced to see what had been invisible for too long. In the end, her story is not only about what was taken, but what was revealed. A darkness that spanned years, a truth too long ignored, and a community that still holds space for a girl who never came home.